All right, welcome to the Romans Education Part 2, and this is session 9A. We're in Romans chapter 12 and verse 8. We're going through the practical offices, and these practical offices are necessary for the operations of the local church to be able to be carried out, and very encouraging to me. This did not take place the first times that we went through the doctrine, but it is taking place now. And it doesn't mean it takes place at the same moment for every individual. Don't panic about that. But it is taking place, so much so that, as a matter of fact, let me just lay this out. This will kind of segue us right into the lesson here. That when you get this first form of doctrine in Romans chapter 12, verses 3 through 8, of course, remember those verses 6 through 8, that's the godly labor. When you get that in you and it really gets generated in you and you start looking for ways to integrate that into your everyday conduct and behavior, that's the godly living aspect of it. When you start doing that and then you find out what the operation of God is that He wants specifically accomplished, and you go, oh, I could put this to work in that area and now I'm laboring with my Father. That's a surprise to some people. I thought we were going to have to go over to the book of Ephesians before I could actually labor with God in something. But you're able to do that right off the bat. You begin laboring with God in it. And if this is working in you properly, there's a verse over in 1 Thessalonians where Paul says this, "But concerning brotherly love, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you, for ye yourselves are taught of God to love one another." That doesn't mean they didn't receive any instruction at all. Of course they did. But the Thessalonian assembly is an advanced assembly. And what Paul was saying is, he could see that the doctrine that they already understood was having such an effect on them that they were beginning now to let that doctrine influence the way they were thinking and living, so that the next step of it, they began to do that before Paul even wrote to them about it. And so when he saw that, he said, you don't need me to write to you about it, because ye yourselves are taught of God. Now, what does he mean they're taught of God? What he's saying is, this doctrine that you did get presented to you, that effectually worked in you, has produced in you now this next step that you'd be taking in your life. And so I'm seeing that next step happen, because the next form of doctrine is in chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. And when we get into the end of verse 10, you're going to get again the godly labor. And let me tell you what I'm seeing, not just in one or two people, but from a number of people, is I see that because we're in this, and we're not even quite finished with verse 8 yet, but I see them doing the godly labor of verse 10 as a result of the godly selfless love in verse 8, verses 6, 7, and 8 being generated in them. It would naturally produce that next thing. As a matter of fact, when you look at it, it's not a quantum leap. It's just the natural next step. And so that's being produced. And by the way, I didn't see that produced any of the other times that we've gone through this doctrine. So I am really encouraged by that. And so as we look at these offices now, and we think about how we're going to be not only serving the Lord, but serving the body out of these offices, when it comes to, now I'm going to take you to figure 1 in your note takers. Here's what you have. When you come to the office of giving, giving is like the hands of the body. And I just think of it that way because anytime you're going to give somebody something, you just hand it to them, right? And so giving is kind of like the hands of it. But when it comes to this next office that we're going to be talking about, the office of ruling, that is like the eyes of the body. Because this means we're going to be looking out at the function of the assembly, and we're going to be noticing something that needs to be taken care of. And then we're going to want to do something about that so our Father's operations can be carried on with regard to that. And so, it's not really about what kind of members we have, or how affluent or not affluent we are. None of those things really come into play. What's really at stake and what we're talking about here are people who understand that these are the minimum number of offices that need to be functioning in any local assembly in order for it to actually be a body. Now I'm going to take you back to the first sentence I said to you tonight. It is critically important that this group began to function as a body. But I want us to understand that we are really part of a bigger group. You don't think about it because you don't see it, except when, like last week when Larry Daniels was here and he said, we feel like we're part of you and we love you, and we just want you to know what you're doing is so important to us. And it's hard for you sometimes to see those people that are out there, but they really are depending on us. Which is why one of the things I would really like for us to do is to think about, once again, beginning to live stream these Tuesdays. And that's how they view themselves. So they see you as their fellow members. They see me as their pastor. I mean, that does sound kind of strange, doesn't it? When somebody calls you up from Kansas City and says, hey, you're our preacher. Okay. But I mean, really, I do get that because they don't have a church near them that may even rightly divide the word, let alone talk about sonship. And so as we get ready to go through this, so these offices become really important because not only are we going to function out of those offices, they're going to function right alongside us out of those offices. Having said that, the next Tuesday that we come, some of the most important information that I have to give you is going to come out next week as we look at the last office of mercy. Because that is going to be a way that we're going to get equipped to do some very difficult things that I know up to this point, many of you are already wondering how to do that. Because, and I'm not talking about it this week, but I'm just saying the mechanics of how that works. To just say it in a couple of sentences, if you have ever had somebody say to you, if you've ever visited somebody in the hospital, and they say, would you pray for me? If you've ever wondered, okay, exactly what is it I'm going to pray for them? And exactly what is it I am expecting as a result of this prayer? And why am I doing it this way? Not only that, but how about when you have a conversation with someone who is going through some kind of a tragic circumstance, and you wonder, what is it that I could possibly say to them? And so I'm going to be talking to you about the two groups of people that we're going to have to learn to talk to and pray for, and to do it properly. Because we can always do what the world does, right? All you have to do is show up at a funeral, and folks at a funeral, they feel bad for this family who's lost a loved one, and they wish they could do something, to encourage them, but they don't know what to say. I don't want us to be in that boat. I want us to know what to say and why that is the thing to say. And not only that, but what we should expect as a result of saying that. How it actually does benefit anybody. And so if we learn to do that, that's a very powerful tool that'll actually go to work within the office of mercy. So we're talking about learning the mechanics behind that. And when I say doing it properly, I don't mean, let me just say some things about how sorry I am and all that. Not that that's evil or anything like that, but if this is done properly, there are elements that will be in every prayer and elements that will be in every conversation that actually have the ability to be beneficial to the people you're trying to minister to. And then you have to figure out which of those two groups they are part. Are you talking to somebody who already knows something about sonship because you will talk to them in one way, or are you talking to people who don't have any idea about sonship and you're going to talk to them in a very different way? but you're still going to have something to say. So I think this is very valuable to be able to do that. So I know that what I just did was, now you've seen all three of those practical offices, the one of giving, the one of ruling, and the one of mercy. But we'll talk about that mercy when we get in here next week. Today, we're going to talk about the one of ruling. And so, and look, by the way, don't get to looking at things and saying, because when I say, boy, I see things happening, don't go home today and say, boy, I don't know if that's happening in my life, but maybe I just better throw in the towel. Where in Paul's epistles did you learn that? I just want to remind you now, that's not godly thinking. That's the thinking that comes from the flesh, and that's the thinking that comes from the adversary. He would love for you to throw in the towel. So, I'm going to say two words to you. Don't quit. I know there's not a lot of doctrine behind that, but you know what? Don't quit. I could tell you a story about that, but we'll save it for another time. The group was never better off without you. Are you with me there? I can say that to you today because nobody's saying that yet. Because when people start saying that, they don't hear it then. So I'm telling it to you now. Godly thinking doesn't include that. That's not part of the doctrinal instruction in Paul's epistles. And so God, you know what? He gave you the spirit of adoption. He made you spiritually fit for His plan and purpose. He gave you the same word that He gave everyone else, and He can do the same work in you that He can do in anyone else. And so just remember that, because the important thing, Romans chapter, I'm just going to read these verses to you. They'd normally be up on the PowerPoint, but again, we don't have it. Romans 13:14. But put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. The important thing is to be putting on the Lord Jesus Christ. Concentrate on that. And that way you don't get tempted to go in the other direction. Now we turn our full attention to this gifts in Romans chapter 12 and verse 8. Verse 8 says this, or he that exhorteth on exhortation, he that giveth, let him do it with simplicity. Somebody tell me, what does it mean to give with simplicity?
Without conditions.
Yeah, without conditions, without restrictions, all right? And he that ruleth with diligence. And so this is not the kind of ruling when the Bible talks about the office of bishops and deacons with regard to edification. Sometimes it uses this word of ruling. But it's not talking about edification, and in other words, being responsible for edification. So in figure 2, I'm going to break this definition of the office down into 3 parts because I think it'll make it easy for you to remember that way. So this is where a member of the assembly will, the first part, oversee a particular job. The office of ruling is where you oversee a particular job which is needed to provide benefits, which is needed to provide some kind of benefit to either another member, or I'm going to put S in a parenthesis, or other members, or to the assembly as a whole, or to the body of Christ in general. I know that's everybody, but look, this office isn't always about doing something for the entire body of Christ. Sometimes it's just about doing it for the local assembly, because the needs of every local assembly can vary from group to group. So sometimes this office will provide for something to be done in this assembly, not needed in another one. I'm going to give you an example of that today as I kind of define for you this office of ruling. But sometimes it may be just for a group of members. Maybe they are engaged together in a very particular office. And so what you're going to be doing now is benefiting them specifically to carry out that office successfully. That's fine. And sometimes it may be just for another member who has a particular circumstance in which they need that kind of help. And so there's the definition, there's the official definition of ruling, and it may include managing others in the accomplishment of the job. It may be just you alone. But someone is going to need to be responsible in the office of ruling for making sure that that thing gets done. And this has nothing to do with being someone's tutor and governor. This has to do with providing for order in the local church. So someone has to be responsible for that. That would be the person in the office of ruling. Let me ask you a question. Can you participate in the office of giving and help someone else at the same time who has the office of ruling? Absolutely. So I just want to make sure that we're all clear about that this is not oh no, I've already got something I'm doing.
That's not my job.
That's not my job, right. Yeah. And so, all right. So now, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. In here, let me just use here. Years ago, Hilda used to be our bookkeeper. And so when Cross Branch got formed, Hilda was the bookkeeper, and she kept track of all that and how the finances were and what those were. And then when Hilda was no longer doing that, then Irma took that over, and Irma did that bookkeeping. And then when Irma gave that up, Tracy took that. We really go through them, don't we? I mean, man, we wear them out. But the thing is, that is an office of ruling. Do you know what it is? It is an office of responsibility that has actually been discharged to the benefit of the assembly, so that we know where we are. Now, this is a little bit different because here, this is Bob and Boo's home. So you know what? Bob pays the electric bill. And he, I guess he pays all the bills, doesn't he? Okay, so I mean, but you know what? But you need to know where you stand financially, right? You need to be able to keep track of that, and so someone has to do that, and that is to the benefit of folks that are participating in that. We have someone in Monahans that does the same kind of thing. Let me give you another example. When I was part of a church in Shreveport, it was at that time, back in the early, maybe mid-'70s, there weren't all the mega churches on every corner like we have today. And so a church that ran about 1,500 was a pretty good-sized church back then. And so in this church, because they also had a school, so you had an auditorium, and then you had Sunday school classrooms, and then you had school buildings. And what happened was you had parking lots on all kinds of sides of buildings that were not visible to each other, and they were spread way out. And so, you know what, you may park across the street to the front doors of the church, but you may be parking in the back over by the school building, and because you're dropping off, kids over there or something. And so what we had was a man who was in charge of the parking lot patrol, Mr. Hayes. And he was a good man, and he loved the Lord, and he was just kind of a solid individual, probably the perfect guy to do that kind of job. And it was his job to fill the positions to get men out in the parking lot. Can anybody imagine why in the world would you need anybody in the parking lots of a church that had parking lots spread all over? Security would be one, because if you're worried about somebody breaking in your car, you're probably not paying too much attention to what's going on in the service. There's another thing that can be done there. So what else would that be? That's right. There's a lot of people, and on any given Sunday, you got people who are there for the first time. And guess what? These are the first people they see. These guys are really the PR people for the church. And if they're smiling and welcoming these people, and I see you got kids, and let me show you where the nursery is, and walk them right over. You folks live around here. We're so glad you're here. And just being friendly, you know what? You're just trying to get them at ease. You're helping them get their kids settled. Let me show you where the auditorium is. All of those kinds of things are very important. So you have more than one guy in a parking lot, Because you don't want to abandon that while you're walking these folks in. So you have several folks. So somebody has to organize that. I don't have to go into the detail of it. You can kind of imagine it, can't you? And here's the other thing. You have to make sure that the 4 guys that are overseeing the school parking lot are not actually sitting in the corridor out of the wind, drinking coffee and fellowshipping while somebody's opening the trunk of the last 6 cars in the parking lot. What do they need to be doing? Somebody has to make sure that they're actually out there patrolling. Because you know how many incidents it takes? Do you know how many cars need to be broken into in the church parking lot before everybody gets distracted with that? You just need 1. And now that's what everybody's worried about. And so you have to keep that in mind. What about when a guy calls in sick and he goes, hey, I'm not going to be able to be on parking lot patrol. Now it's up to Mr. Hayes to find somebody to fill that spot. Or we're going to be on vacation for 2 weeks. I'm not going to be there. Here's the next thing. You don't want the same guys in the parking lot every single Sunday. Why? Because they're not getting anything spiritually. They're not in the services. So you got to rotate those guys so that they're only out there once every 8 to 10 weeks. So they're out there once, but the next 8, 9 weeks, they're right in there with their family in the services, and they're hearing all the things that are being said, and they're benefiting from it. And so there's a whole lot of details that go into that. Guess what? Once Mr. Hayes took the office of ruling over the parking lot, by the way, we didn't know to call it that. We did not call it that back then. We just needed parking lot patrol. We did not see it as accomplishing any operation of our Heavenly Father. We just saw it keeping people from stealing other people's stuff. But if we're going to see it the way our Heavenly Father looks at it, you know what we're really doing? Is we're creating an atmosphere that is conducive for edification of the saints to take place. If indeed that is taking place in there. So I'm just saying, indirectly, these offices are providing for that. So that would be the office of ruling, which means Mr. Hayes now has to make all those decisions. He has to keep up with that. It was a big job. It really was.
Nowadays they have policemen out there.
Sometimes they hire police and they come out and do that. And then somebody's got to do that. Somebody's got to call them and let's make sure they're out there. All these, I'm just trying to give you a couple of illustrations because at the church in Monahans, here, we don't have 5 guys patrolling the parking lots. There's only a lot. It's beside this house, which you can't find if you're coming here on purpose, let alone folks targeting you here. You know what the real advantage is? If they're stealing anything out of our car, they're still wandering around somewhere on this property when we get out of Bible study. Probably willing to give themselves up. Just please point me the way out. You know how many pizza people, they laugh now when I walk into Pizza Hut? The delivery guys, if they've been there any length of time, they've been out here. And so I walk in and I go, "You're on tonight?" He said, "I'm off in 10 minutes, but the next guy, he's been out there before." He said, "Let me tell you, my first time out there, it was a nightmare." I said, "Really? 1,000 Summers Drive?" He says, "Yeah, but you come to Summers Drive and you're looking here and you don't know what that is. Here's a street. I go down that street. No, these numbers don't match." So I said, "Okay, I'll go this way." He turns left at the first fork, which puts him where? Somewhere in Hyco?
No, you can't get out.
Yeah, I know, you can't. Well, that's why there's a pizza car at the bottom of that canyon behind Bob's studio. I'm just saying, you know what? They all have these stories about, trying to find it. We don't have, and my only point to that is to just say, that church in Shreveport had an office of ruling that not every church has to have to that degree. So these offices of ruling, God doesn't list what they're supposed to be because they're different from place to place. And so as you look around and you see things in the assembly that need to be accomplished, and you may look and say, "Yeah, but it's a little bit different here." It is, because of the circumstance of this, it is a little bit different. But as we complete these offices, you are going to be able to notice some things that need to be done for the benefit of this assembly as a whole or for the rest of the body, and you're going to have an opportunity to engage in that office. And that is an important part of the process that we're talking about here. Okay, so let me flip over here and see. All right, so let's talk about choosing this office just for a moment. You have to remember why God created the local assembly in the first place. The reason God created the local assembly is so that, this is where you jump in.
Edification.
Okay. So I'm not going to argue with that. It is for edification, but I'm actually thinking of the more broad title that includes that, but includes some other. Yeah. God looks at this and he says, there are some things that I want to have accomplished in this world. In order to do that, I'm going to create local assemblies. And those local assemblies are going to carry out the work of the ministry. And the work of the ministry, as you know, and we've done note takers on this, is comprised of two main issues. The first one is getting the gospel to the lost. And the second one is, Lulu said, the edification of the saints. That is the purpose behind this. So when you're looking at the offices of ruling, those offices need to be in line with the purposes for a local church. Unfortunately, what has happened through the years, it seems like everything starts out with this great noble cause and purpose, but at some point, usually after whoever founded it passes away and the next group comes in, it begins to shift its focus a little bit. May not do away with that first one, but it's got some other things now it's interested in. And by the time they call it the sociological cycle of, and I can't remember what that last word was, but it really talks about how things start out being one thing and they're all dedicated to it and everybody thinks this is really great. But as that thing goes along, it eventually loses that first goal and purpose altogether, and now it's doing something totally different. And I just remember one of my professors, when he was talking about this, he was talking about folks that were, getting together on their own, they said, we got to have a fire department. We really need a fire department. We're losing too many buildings and people are in jeopardy. And we're going to have to do a volunteer fire. There's no other way to do it. And so they go on this big campaign and they PR the thing. And you know what? Guys come in and they get trained and they're excited. They round up money. They get some equipment. They buy a fire truck. They actually get now a fire station. And now, they got something going. But you know how it is at a fire station? I used to be in Explorers. I know how it is in a fire station. You sit around doing nothing, and now it's a panic. Because now the fire, and you don't know when those are going to take place. And so because guys are kind of sitting around like that, then what happens is they're thinking, gosh, it's just boring here. Could we get a ping pong table up here? Could we get a pool table in here? Just to kind of while the time a little bit. Next thing you know, there's a TV in here. Hey, let's put a kitchenette in here. You know what? Guys can stay here if they got something to eat, So we'll put kind of a kitchen in here and get a refrigerator, and we'll put a pool table in here. Hey, how about we just pour a slab out here and put a basketball hoop out here? Guys get out there and kind of stay in shape, and shoot some basketball. But you know what happened? Eventually, other folks are coming in now because this is a great place to hang out. I mean, you know what? They got hamburgers and hot dogs, being cooked all day long. And you know what? I can play pool and I can go out and shoot a little basketball and I can sit over on the side and talk to Lupe and, I can just hang out and do all that. And then finally, when the calls started coming in, people kind of hated having to be torn from all the things they were like, Lupe, can you go do the fire? Get a couple of guys and go do the fire. The last days. In whose last days? We're not in Israel's last days. Here's the point I want to make. This is what happens when you don't understand how to rightly divide the word of truth. Everything goes into one big melting pot and then you try to make sense of it. And you can't do that. It's Israel's last days. And he says, Israel have a peace treaty in place, Antichrist will confirm and eventually break. He just told you what that is. If that's happening today, who's the Antichrist? Who? He's not going to give you an... Who would that be? By the way, down through the years, almost everybody that people didn't like have been said to be... There was a time when Hitler was the Antichrist and Mussolini was the Antichrist. For some folks, they said Churchill was the Antichrist. Huh? I mean, everybody... It's almost like if you haven't been called the Antichrist, you know what? You just don't know enough people. Because everybody got on that list at some point. Currently, the world governments are striving for an Israeli peace treaty. That doesn't mean a thing. Why? Because we're not in the last days of Israel's program. We're in the dispensation of Gentile grace. Remember what I told you at the first of the lesson last time we were here? Right division is the key to being able to look at some of these things that are said and know instantly that they're bogus. And that's how to know that. Give me this next one, please, Trent. Chaotic weather will be prevalent. Luke 21, 25 to 26. Jesus, you know what that's like? That's like me holding a meeting and trying to make everybody see how smart I am. And I go, you know what? There's someone here that has trouble with headaches. Chaotic weather? Are you kidding me? Jesus foresaw the seas and the waves roaring in the last days. He also likened these signs to birth pangs. The Greek word Odin, often translated as sorrows in Matthew 24:8, literally means birth pangs. Furthermore, and you know what? I'll give you one more too. I had pancakes this morning. I'm just saying, just add that. Furthermore, the Apostle Paul reminds us that the creation itself would be delivered from the curse at the end of the age. Romans 8:21. Look, we've been through Romans 8. You know what the creature is waiting for. The manifestation of the sons of God.
He's not from the King James because he said creation, so creation.
He sure did. And the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs. But wait, when did Paul write that in Romans 8? That's been on the books for a while now. How long? This is a sign of how many generations have come and gone since then. Was everybody supposed to be on the lookout for this? It becomes ridiculous after a while. And so we got to keep going though. As delivery draws near, birth pangs always increase in both intensity and frequency. Therefore, the creation itself would travail as the time of delivery draws near. Of course, chaotic weather is not new, but there are indications that we're witnessing an increase in strange weather.
Wow.
Does he really live in Texas?
This is objective theological reasoning that we just have this kind of weather going on. This is a real, by the way, mixing of the programs. He's got verses in Romans that's not talking about the weather at all. And then he's got the waves and the sea roaring. Those are all part of what's happening over there in the Lord's day of wrath. Here's the next one. There would be a move toward a global government. Daniel 2, 7, and Revelation 13. The former Roman Empire, which encompassed present-day Europe, would revive and eventually dominate the world. Okay, I just have to stop here and say, if I had $1 for every time somebody used the revived Roman Empire, I could write all of y'all a check every month. Look, and there was a day, back before you understand all the things that are going on, that sounded really good, the revived Roman Empire. But I've spent time on this before, so I'm not going to reteach all of that now. But that is not the issue. Look, when Paul's looking at this world, he knows who's in charge. He knows it's the Roman government. He appeals to Caesar and goes to Rome as a prisoner. But you know what? Everything he writes about it, he doesn't say, for there is neither Jew nor Roman. because all Rome did was take over the Greek world. And he says there is neither Jew nor Greek. He stays away from the Roman word. It's really incredible. The European Union has steadily moved forward in an attempt to unite Europe politically and economically. It succeeded in creating a European Parliament, court, and a common currency. And globalization is not unique to Europe. It is happening everywhere. And so there'd be a move toward a global government. Now, I know that this probably not going to sit well with everybody. I get that. But first of all, when the Antichrist comes on the scene, I understand the terminology being used over there, but his activities, I believe, are focused on and restricted to that area in the Middle East. I don't believe that's happening in China. I don't believe he has control of Canada or Australia or South Africa. I don't think that he has. I think his activities, and the Bible does talk about, I don't know, I may have put this verse in there. I hope I did.
Except that, like the mark of the beast, specifically states it be worldwide.
Well, when he,
Some things, but I agree with you on his main focus is there because that's the land.
that's the land, and that's the thing that's under dispute. Here's when the Bible, and I know that you can look at some of that and say, well, but I'm trying to think of another verse too, not the one on the mark, but I'm trying to think of another one. But it's talking about the whole world. But you have to understand the Bible uses that term in a way that doesn't mean the entire globe. If you remember when when Jesus was going to be born, everybody, it said that the whole world would be taxed.
Another one in there in Revelations where it's talking about the angels flying through the air, preaching the gospel, the everlasting gospel
Right.
to the whole world.
The whole world. See, and I think that's true. All the Gentile nations have to respond to that. Yeah. So the fact to say that the Antichrist is going to be, controlling every, I just don't see that. And so I know they're talking about, now I don't deny that there's always been a push toward globalization. I don't deny that that's happening. I just don't, what's happening today is not the fulfillment of the prophetic program. And that's really the point. Okay, here's a good one. We're going to do this one twice. It's so good. Oh, did I miss this one? 14, 15. How did I miss that? Let me just see where this is. Oh, okay. Increasing interest in vegetarianism anticipated in 1 Timothy 4:3-4. The New Age movement has swept the globe during the past 40 years, popularizing this. That's not what 1 Timothy 4 is about. If you live next door to a vegan, please do not start looking at them as a minion of the Antichrist. If they live in Texas, you wonder why they don't eat barbecue. But let me just say, that's not what 1 Timothy is talking about. Again, I started to do all this work to show you that. All you have to do is go over, it talks about commanding to abstain from meats and all that kind of stuff. Folks, we're talking about as a religious observance. Okay? That's what we're talking about there. Okay. And by the way, do you know any religion that commands to abstain from meats?
Well, the Catholics used to, they don't.
Yeah, they did. They used to. I grew up in Louisiana. In Louisiana, we don't have counties. The only state in the Union doesn't have counties. You know what we have? Parishes. You know why it's a parish? Because of the heavy Catholic influence in the state. And every school in the state of Louisiana on Friday served fish. That was part of the religious influence of Catholicism on that state. Yeah, right. So we're not talking about abstaining from meat as a lifestyle, but as a religious practice. I was giving you an example of that. Here's the next one. Jesus foretold that there'd be fearful sights, Luke 21:11. The Greek word translated fearful is phobotron, which can also be translated terror. I love it. This is great, isn't it? According to the U.S. State Department, between 1981 and 2006, there were more than 38,000 international terrorist attacks. So there would be fearful sights in Luke 21, and there would, and so this is terror attacks. Would you like to see the verse? Let me show you the verse. And great earthquakes shall be in diverse places, and famines and pestilences, and here it is, fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. But you understand all of that, no, back me up. All of that is in a context. These are things that are happening in the world that are not necessarily orchestrated by men. These are things that are orchestrated in nature. Do you see? So you can go to the Greek. This is why I hate that. That's why we don't do that. Because you can invent anything you want if you just got a Greek lexicon as your final authority. So thank God we have a Bible as our final authority. Okay, and so one more, Luke 21:25. And there'll be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Look, men's hearts failing them for fear and looking after those things that are coming on the earth. I'm just going to tell you, when this really starts happening out there in the day of wrath, you have nothing previously to compare it to. You might look and say, boy, the climate is really changing. This is way different. Something much more. Okay, I got 2 minutes, so let me do this. Did they already deliver? Great, okay. This is the one I thought we were going to be on. So we're going to do this one twice. Once here and once right toward the end. Because everybody does this. Multitudes will travel to and fro, Daniel 12:4. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, few individuals traveled beyond their own communities. Until recently, horse, foot, and boat were the only modes of transportation. Yet today we travel by car, bus, plane, train, subway, etc. Millions and millions are running to and fro just as Daniel prophesied 2,500 years ago. So I'll show you the verse. Here it is. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Now, he didn't talk about the knowledge increase. That's why we're going to talk about it again at the end of the second session, because I want to touch on that. This is not talking about the technology of transportation. There is a context to this. And transportation advancements is not in that context. Daniel has been given an addition. Look, you know what you had prior to this? Here's what you had. You had the fifth, you had the 5 courses of punishment. When they get into the Babylonian, which is that fifth, that first installment, so let's call it 5-1, that first installment of the 5th course of punishment, that is that 70 years of the Babylonian captivity, right? Daniel's in that captivity. And then he is given an advancement. He's actually praying about that and wondering, is this it? Or is it over, or is there something else? He gets an answer, and he gets now an advancement on that timetable in the 70 weeks prophecy. And that 70 weeks prophecy gets divided up into 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and 1 week. And those are the things that take you from here, those are the things that take you all the way through to the time that Messiah is cut off. Right? So he gets an advancement about how things are going to happen on the timeline. The last week is what we refer to as Daniel's 70th week, and that's usually what is commonly referred to as the 7 years of tribulation. And so here's what's going to happen. Daniel gets this revelation, and then he's going to tell them, look, a lot of people are going to be running around trying to figure out what is happening with regard to this issue. And then he's going to tell them, but knowledge shall be increased. This knowledge does get increased. When does it get increased? It gets increased just before God goes silent to the nation for 400 years. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And specifically in Zechariah, before God goes silent, he gives them those 4 beholds, those 4 ways that they're going to behold their Messiah when he shows up. Because after the 400 years of silence, you know what you're going to have to break that silence? The forerunner of the Messiah, John the Baptist. And he says, I want you to be able to identify him. So you know what they have for them that they can look at then? They have 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And those 4 Gospels are each one talking about one of the ways that they're able to behold their Messiah and identify him. That's an advancement. Then you get the 400 years of silence, and then Jesus comes along, and guess what? He's going to give you another advancement. He's going to give you details that weren't sitting back in the Old Testament prophets. I already talked to you about one of those. The Old Testament certainly talked about a believing remnant, but the Lord Jesus is going to talk about a remnant within the remnant. Something that did not get talked about in the Old Testament at all. Not only that, there's some other things as well. So my point is to say, the knowledge that's going to be increased, because when we see this at the end, it's going to say, think of all the advancements in science we got. In fact, the guy is he's going to say, we can hold this little device in our hand and see someone's picture from all the way across the country. Knowledge is increased. But he's not talking about that. He's talking about the knowledge of what's going on with Israel. And by the way, there's one more advancement after this. I'll wait and give you that when we get to this at the very end. Okay, so we'll stop here and we'll take a break.